So Seth will let everybody come into the room.
Great.
I see people arriving. How do you like your Wacom One?
I absolutely love it. And I'm not just saying that. Uh, one of the reasons that I was really interested in the One was because I was using the 16 and I have it up on an arm in my setup here. And, you know, for me, what we call clipping, which is using the pen tool in Photoshop to draw Bezier curves around stuff to set up all of our masks and path library. That's like a big part of our work, and working with a tablet that's on the desk and the screen that's up in front of you. You know, I've been using Wacom tablets for like 20 years, and I'm pretty sure I'm as good as I'm going to get at using them. There was always just this gap, and it's just a hand-eye coordination thing. When I was drawing my paths around stuff, it was like I could get to this 80 to 85% accuracy range with my tablet. So what that means is like the line on the contour would always just be a little off and I'd have to go back and fix stuff. So once I got a Wacom One, and this is what I've been telling all of my colleagues who traditionally have not used Cintiqs very much for commercial retouchers, it's not a big part of our workflow until now. The Wacom One like improved my speed and accuracy like by a factor of like 2 times to 3 times. Like it just makes it so much faster and accurate. I think that's probably surprising because most people think of the Wacom display tablets as for illustrators, but I tested it. It's not. It's for retouchers too.
Well, I love that. Thank you, Seth. Thank you for thank you for the quick review of the wonderful Wacom One. We will certainly have a promo code we will share at the end.
Oh, cool.
All right. Well, everyone's here, and maybe they don't want to listen to, I mean, maybe they do want to hear a review of the Wacom One. But first, they want to know, how do you make that, which is the topic of this webinar. And basically what we're going to do is Seth McCullough is going to take us through his retouching Photoshop files. So we're going to see some layers. We're going to see some retouching technique over the course of this webinar.
Yeah. So,
oh wait, hang on, Seth. I have more slides. I'm going to tell you, I'm going to say, Seth, start when it's time.
Okay. I'll hold tight.
I am your host. I'm Melissa Ashcraft, and I work with the community team here at Wacom. We've been around now for 35 years, if you can believe it. And basically, if you've ever tried to do any type of photo editing with a mouse, you know how difficult that is. So Wacom makes tools to help your photo editing as well as your art and animation really become a smooth, fabulous experience. Next slide, please. Okay, so we have a couple of rules, more like guidelines. And this is about a 1-hour session. We will save the last few minutes for Q&A. If you have a question, please use the Q&A feature. That is the easiest way for us to answer them. And then we'll check in with you as we go. Sev will answer questions throughout. And if we don't get to them, we will share a link afterward to the video on YouTube. All right, Seth, are you ready?
Yeah, totally.
Okay, you are up. Please welcome Seth McCullough.
All right. Thank you guys for having me. I'm really stoked to be here. What I thought I would do in this session is, rather than try to teach, like specific retouching techniques, I think what people often really find that they don't get to see is what goes into a real retoucher's commercial retouching file. like in their PSD. It's not always pretty, but it's something that we don't get access to very often. It's usually kept pretty tight. And I like showing off stuff that people normally don't have access to, because it's interesting, and it helps give perspective as to like what the standards are and how we work, because commercial retouchers often are, you know, locked away in dark rooms, and very few people have access to those dark rooms, and their secrets and techniques traditionally have been kept under pretty tight lock and key. And that always didn't really sit right with me, and is one of the reasons why I started teaching. So let's jump in. I'm going to show you my screen. I got a couple files open here from jobs over the past many years. These are real commercial campaigns, and they went out and lived in the wild. Let me switch my screen here. All right. So I've got four very different images here. Product beverage image, which those have particular challenges because anything in beverage that we do is going to involve transparency, liquid, lots of reflections. So understanding how to deal with all of those visual elements is going to be, you know, much different than some of the challenges we might run into with a more straight ahead product type shot. So I work in the Pacific Northwest, which is a very sports heavy retouching market, and living here and working with these clients on these projects, we've had to develop some really, really robust retouching workflows, because things need to change dramatically regularly. Imagine a basketball player is wearing the wrong uniform, and we have to stick with that shot, but we have to change the uniform on him, stuff like that. And we also—
Hey, Steph, can I
Yeah,
interrupt?
go
So the
ahead.
chat, already our chat, I love our chat, team chat. They are saying that it's blurry what you're showing. So if can you go down to the bottom of Zoom and hit the green button for share screen?
Yes, okay, I remember this being an issue. So I think I'm going to share screen one. Does this look
Ooh,
better?
that's perfect.
All right.
We love it. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. That's what I forgot to do.
Yay,
Um,
Carlos says yes with exclamation points.
okay. One of these days, I'm going to remember all the steps. Yeah, so one of the other things we have to do is build our files in a way that we can continually change them and not get painted into a corner, because our clients are always asking for lots of changes. So this is more of a creative retouch, I would call it. It's still product oriented, but the majority of the magic is in all these lighting effects and color grading, and really complex compositing. These can be pretty challenging, especially if you're not in contact with the photographer when they're shooting everything, which I wasn't in this case. So I had to find pretty creative ways of using the elements that he captured without him knowing very much about creative compositing. I mean, let's see here. So I've got this product. The product has to be really beautiful and also accurate and clean, and also exist in this space with all these lighting effects. So you can imagine, if you're doing some of this work or testing some of your own photographs to try to approach clients like Sony here, one of the top priorities is going to be creating a really like compelling visual creation while also presenting their product in a way that people can see it as a product. It's not obscured by you know, the lighting or the atmosphere, stuff like that. So going into 100%, I mean, you can see how big a file like this is. It's huge. So to some degree, you really have to be thinking about every molecule, every pixel in this image. Sometimes I call this molecular retouching, and it can be pretty time consuming. I'm just going to start digging through the layers. Now you can see here, and probably some of you are going, Seth, don't you always say name all your layers? Sometimes I'm pretty guilty of having a pretty mangled file. But so this is one of the important things to know about creative retouching. Lots of times in creative retouching, I'm moving super fast and loose because I need to generate an overall look and feel that I can sell through to the client. And if I'm sitting there like prepping every single element perfectly initially in a creative retouching file, that's going to take me too long. And that also gets in the way of creative output for me. And sometimes that comes around and bites me, because if I set this file up fast and loose with all this, you know, color that I'm exploring and changing constantly, lots of times the client will get to a point where they're happy with the creative that you've made, and they go, cool, ship it. And I'm like, wait. Like, there's a lot of garbage in here. There's a lot of edges. There's a lot of crud that I need to clean up. So I really try to define that with clients as to, and you know, you can do this in a lot of different types of retouching, you know, even fashion and beauty, is establishing that this is a phase of creative exploration. A lot of people will call it low res comping because it can be easier to work at a lower res so you can get ideas out faster. And then just working with clients to make clear that after we get our creative, you know, treatment approved, we've got to move into the high res version to make this commercial grade so it can, you know, go out into the world on giant billboards and, you know, digital spaces in store where people are standing this close to it and can see mistakes that you make.
Steph, do you have the original file available? One of our audience members was hoping to see the original shot first.
I figure somebody was going to ask for that. Well, since it's so many pieces, it's a little tough to show just completely stripped away, but I can get pretty close here. So this is the product before I applied my sort of grading and punch to it. So it consists of a few things. There's this glow around the strip, and there's a bunch of color work that I did in here to punch it up. So like a contrast curve. There's a little bright spot in the center. The top was too bright, so I darkened that down. And all of these adjustments, you know, didn't really necessarily happen in one go. And that's why we stack up our work in this way. So there's a lot of work that goes in here into these lighting strips. A lot of color shifts. And then of course we got to make the logo nice. And then bump up those strobes. So that's pretty close to the original. You can see, so whenever you see this FS here, this is my frequency separation, and especially in product-centric retouching, my frequency separation is the beating heart of every single file that I make. It's what allows me to do all of my cleanup, all my pixel manipulation in a way that is fast, high quality, super flexible, in a way that you would not have in years past without frequency separation. So if you're wondering what that is. And these are some old frequency separation actions that I have since fixed up, and you can actually go to frequencyseparation.com and download those for free. So you can see the, you know, a lot of the cleanup that was done on the speaker itself. And this is where I, you know, clean off any like dust specks and any product defects. So, and you'll see I have, you know, the speaker is isolated in the scene. This is a particular type of commercial retouching workflow. Is I want basically that speaker completely isolated in a masked group of its own. So, you know, when the client says, you know, move it or something, I mean, there's some cleanup to do down here, but I've already built that flexibility into my file. And you'll see that not only the speaker, but the table is isolated too. So I can really bring this down. And I have this background that I'm just free to work on, because you can imagine if I had that table and then that speaker on top and everything was on a single layer, and I just created masks to apply like curves or color to each of those elements. I'm pushing the qualities of these objects so hard that I'm just going to end up with a nightmare of edges when I'm doing color correction. So that's why I just break everything right out up front, put them in different groups, and I'm free to just focus on the creative stuff. Is there any other questions in the chat right now?
Not yet.
Cool. No pressure, but if you guys need to ask me anything, stop me. So check out some of these effects. I really love some of these lighting, these beautiful lighting elements that, and this photographer is Eric Ryan Anderson. He's a quite accomplished photographer, and he captured some really cool visual elements here. And I'll just turn them off so we can maybe take a look. So he gave me a library of all this stuff that he captured. And even a very, very skilled, accomplished photographer like Eric Ryan Anderson, he's not a hardcore compositor. He's not a retoucher. That's not his job. So what he's out there doing is his creative best, and he's trying to just create, you know, cool stuff for the brief. And this is what he gave me. So he has no idea what I'm going to do with this. He's just like trusts that I'm going to be able to figure it out. And that's really the job in retouching a lot of the time, is just saying, yeah, sure, I can do that. And then being like, I guess I better figure out how to do that. And after you do that continually over years, confidence grows, and you know you can figure this stuff out. So what I had to do is think about, how am I going to isolate this thing? Like, I could just set it to screen blend mode, but it's doing all sorts of crazy stuff in here, and I can't really control it. I knew I wanted to isolate just these lighting elements. So I'm going to show you the mask that I created. So this mask is applied to this layer because I knew I wanted to isolate that, and just doing a blanket blend mode on the whole layer was just not enough. So what I do is I turn that off, go into my channels, and I'm going to it's as simple as this. I can just select all, copy with all these composite. And we'd ideally want this in the same spot. But what I've done is I pasted this, just basically the composite image into a new channel. And I'm just going to run a curve to just darken the blacks because, I mean, a mask is just black and white, right? So I just want to tune this mask up a little bit. Click OK. And I've got a mask now from the shape of that lighting effect from that layer. And so if I click on it, it sets it as a selection, and then I could go back into my file, and I'll show you here just with like a solid color fill. I've now got this cool lighting visual element, and all it is a color fill with a mask on it. So those are the kinds of solutions that I had to come up with for this creative. I'm going to turn it back to screen. So not only did I have a mask on it, but it's also in a blending mode. And now, like with a hue sat layer, I can change the color because it's set to colorize here. And I can change it to anything. So that isn't so much a tutorial of how you should do this, but it's that thinking around not just throwing a blend mode on something and hoping it works, because sometimes that's not good enough. Thinking about ways to break down the visual elements of your retouched image into these component parts that you have the highest degree of control over. Because what I want to do is be able to move something when I want and control the color, brightness, or other visual quality of that element in a matter of minutes. Because when my client comes back with a whole load of comments, I need to turn this around pretty quickly, and I can't be like, well, I need 3 days to go, research how I can actually make this visual element change.
Seth, you were just talking about clients, and we have a question from Facebook related to color and client expectations. The question is, not everybody's monitor is calibrated, and clients constantly tell me my color is incorrect because they are looking on their cell phones or laptops. How do I get around this problem?
Well, find a job in a different industry. This is like the thing. Everybody's looking on different screens, okay? And it's a tough thing to educate a client about. But you nailed it right on the head. Is if you guys are reviewing this on your phone or like a tablet, it's going to look very different. And if you give me feedback based on what it looks like on that display, I can do those changes for you. But where is this going to be used in the end? Is it going to be used on a phone? Okay, maybe we need to really make changes to it that optimize it for the phone. Or maybe there's just a version of it that we need to optimize for the phone. And then we have our key art that is going to live on your website. So people are going to be looking at that on screens too. So what's our priority here? I think one of those strategies for educating clients is just that. Like, rather than coming back and saying, you don't know what you're talking about, don't review this on your phone, it's more a process of asking questions, because often if you just use that kind of like as a ninja strategy, when a client comes to you with a request or something that seems like clearly just insane to you, come back, just keep asking questions about it like that. And then often you can lead them back to understanding that they were wrong in the first place, or that they were making a foolish decision or direction to you. In my experience, it's tough, but that's the best way to get somebody to realize that they just asked you to do something that makes no sense. So I'll just real quick cruise through and see what I did here. FX. So there's this overall kind of, sometimes I will just, you know, throw throw a completely screened blend mode layer over everything, because it just adds a nice quality, and I got away with it here. You know, I painted it out a little bit on this mask here in places, but it just added a nice atmosphere. So the table, I seem to remember he only captured some of the table here. So I did a bunch of content aware fills. So Photoshop is really, really smart when it comes to content aware, and their content aware tools are becoming better and better every day. So let me see if I can recreate this so you can see what it actually does. So I did some initial color work here because I think I had to, yeah. So what I have is this table in pieces because just the framing, he wasn't able to capture it all. So I got to put together this, this table, and I got a good start. What I did was I just merged these layers up because I wanted a flat pixel layer here. And you know, I just want to fill in these areas that, you know, I didn't want to clone. I want to clone as little as possible. And I'll show you how I sort of facilitate my laziness using content aware. So I just made a selection of the areas here that I didn't have any table information for. I don't know about you, but that still looks like a painful cloning operation to me. So what I just do is edit, fill, content aware. A lot of you probably didn't even know when you do edit, fill, content aware is an option, and it's so awesome. I use it constantly just with the default settings. And I'm gonna see if I can hide my selection. Selection's still there, I just hit it so you can see. And I ran content aware fill on it. It's thinking, doing its magic. Hopefully it works. I 9 times out of 10 get a good result, at least a good starting result with content aware fill. I mean, that's still pretty good, you know, still pretty good. And then if I run my frequency separation on this layer, I might need to stamp up so it doesn't, I'm sort of working on the fly here, but this is the process that I usually use. This is incredibly useful if you're shooting a model on a seamless, okay? I just did this on a video that I'm gonna be posting soon. So I always want to, once I start retouching on like a, you know, fashion or portrait image, I almost always want to just pop the model off the background as quickly as possible. And this is a really, really fast and easy way to do it, especially if you're shooting somebody on something that's continuous, like a seamless background. You can really do like a loose selection around a model and do edit, fill, content aware fill. And it will 9 times out of 10 almost completely take the model off that seamless background. And it'll leave you usually just some kind of little areas of smudgy stuff that you don't want, that it couldn't really figure out. And, you know, such an easy way to resolve that and to clean that up is to just now run a frequency separation on that, split it into tone and texture, and you can just wipe away, honestly, the garbage that that was left behind by content aware fill. And so if I use my trusty mixer brush and I'm working on my tone layer, I'm going to turn my texture off. I can just really quickly and easily, if I have the right brush on, sorry, my brush has just got reset. Okay. I can just recreate this table in like a matter of minutes. There's going to be some cloning involved in these areas here, but I mean, all I'm doing is just smudging the pixels because I'm on my tone layer. I've broken my image up into 2 components, texture and tone. So that's how I tackle an extension like that. And then on the texture, you know, I'd go back in there, and that's where I'd use my stamp tool to try to bring back, make sure that's set to current layer, bring back some of my texture. But I mean, you see that magic of frequency separation. Once I have separated, processed my file, my photograph into texture and tone, I can just pull texture from anywhere. You know, I don't have to worry about the colors underneath. Yeah, so that's what I call a table extension. So that's what I did with my actual professional grade work, how I extended that table and then put some color on top to integrate. So I'm going to turn these guys off. We can just take a look at the background real quick.
So Saf, I know you're streamlining your workflow a little bit, and the team is asking, or the Facebook chat is asking, are you using a mouse right now on the Wacom stream? And then there are some laughing emojis.
You know what? I'm using a mouse right now on the Wacom stream, and I'm a little embarrassed about that, but let me show you what my setup is. So I think this will work. So this is my, if you can see up here in the right-hand corner of the screen, I have a little window that shows my setup. And this is the small Intuos BT that I use. And in Windows, it's really easy to lose your Bluetooth connection, and that's what just happened. So got to just adapt. People might want to just check out this setup. I know you had it, if you guys can see. Yeah, it's a little wonky, but I have 2 screens on my right-hand side over here. There's my 16 and my Wacom One on the table. And then I have my main display here. So for all of this, especially for doing that frequency separation brushing, I would absolutely be using a tablet because, you know, doing it with the mouse is super painful.
And so noisy with all the clicking.
Oh, yeah, I didn't even think about how annoying that must be for you guys to listen to. I'm sorry about that.
That's okay. We have a lot of questions, Seth, and
Yeah,
I know
probably
you have
because I was moving way too fast, showing a bunch of stuff. So thanks for your patience, guys.
So you are the expert and I am simply a marketer. And so I'm going to go through a couple questions for you. These may be having long answers or short answers.
I'll
I
try.
don't know. Um, so there are a lot of questions around flattening your layers. People want to know when you do it. Nick is asking, instead of flatten layers, is it an idea to make a separate file of the FS layers as an example and load that into your composite file as a smart object?
Good
Um,
question.
so there are some questions about the
Around
different
layer,
layers. Yeah.
around layering and like, okay, so sort of a context for working here. I mean, it sounds like you guys asking those questions shows that you know that we're trying to work non-destructively as much as possible. And within a non-destructive workflow, there are many times that stamping up or flattening up, as it's called, is totally fine and non-destructive. So there are times where I might want to offload my frequency separation stack to a linked or embedded smart object because maybe I'm trying to conserve file size or just tidy up my layers. So that's not a bad thing. What I do like though is to be able to work on as much stuff as possible within my composite file, especially when I'm making creative decisions. So having to jump out to a smart object and do work in there can sometimes be a little distracting because you're in a different world. But the point around using smart objects as part of your workflow, which I didn't do a whole lot in this file, just because of a number of factors. Starting to embrace a smart object workflow, at least right now, with the amount of functionality we have, is a good idea. Because what a smart object does is it takes a pixel layer or a layer group that may have adjustment layers within it, and you're saying, I want you to basically wrap that up in a package, encapsulate all that work so it can't be changed anymore, and it turns it into one layer with that little icon. If you can see this here, this is a smart object. So on this background layer, I converted this to a smart object. I stamped up this whole layer group that's got a bunch of stuff in it. Because what I wanted to do after I did all my work integrating all these people is I wanted to blur them, but I did not want to apply a blur to my pixel layer and basically what they call bake the blur into the pixel layer, okay? Because then I'd have to like write down my settings because I'm invariably going to need to go back and do some more changes to the crowd and then stamp it up again and get the blur back on. So you can see after and before, after and before. It's just a bit of a blur. And because it's a smart filter and I use blur gallery, I can double click on that smart filter because it's a blur applied to a smart object. And I can go and change my blur. If the client says that's too much, I don't have to remember what the settings are. I've got it right here. And that's the beauty of a smart object workflow. Most filters can be applied to a smart object as a smart filter, so you can keep going back to change them. So when people are asking when to stamp up, is that bad? Is it good? I usually stamp up when I need to either protect a bunch of work that I did, or I need to apply a filter to it. So real quick, I'll just show you what the crowd looked like. So if I turn the crowd completely off, what I did was I created this I created this gradient. And gradients can be tough because you probably know there's this problem called banding involved with gradients, especially when you're working in 8-bit, which most of us are when we're doing this type of compositing. I want to be able to work really fluidly when I build gradient backgrounds, and there are ways to eliminate bands from gradients, and I've got an action that I'll do a demo on after on my YouTube channel to show you guys, because it's a really important thing to know how to do. So this gradient is my background, and I just dropped this crowd over it. Now this crowd is all kinds of, you know, hacks and blending modes about, you know, for how to integrate them into the background, because a lot of the crowd was shot backlit, so it provided some particular challenges. So I've just got some color work in here in order to create atmosphere. These are just curves, adjusting colors. And let me just turn this on normal so we can see. This is tricky to work with because we've got dark and light areas, you know, all over the place. So it's not the ideal type of shot for a compositor to use. And in that case, I had to really just mess around with blend modes until I got something that works. Blend modes can be a little sketchy when you're trying to set up a full commercial style work file, because all they do is say blend the whole layer into the rest like this, and there's not much more control that you have with a blend mode. Some of these, and this is sort of the last somewhat interesting part of the construction of this. Just like you saw how I pulled a mask from that lighting effect earlier, I pulled some masks from some of those crowd plates, and really they're not even made out of like pixel layers that are on blend modes anymore. They're just made of like this curve and a mask. So this is what the mask looks like. There's a curve inside of it, and I just turn that on and off. And there you have it. I mean, so that pretty much drills down to the very bottom of that file. Are there any more questions to answer about this file? Because I think we should look at something else for a while.
Okay, go on to the next thing.
Cool.
A lot of the questions are more general about retouching, and there's a lot of questions about clients, and managing client expectations too.
That's the tough one. I'm going to close this out. Yeah, so I mean, you know, when you're managing client expectations, I've written a lot about this because it's a really important and nuanced thing, but so I guess I would say the only really problematic client expectations are the ones that in the beginning you didn't identify. And that goes back to that really asking so many questions up front. When you run into a job that has painful client expectations that just kind of drop on you out of nowhere, in my experience, 9 times out of 10, that was because I didn't ask the right questions and I didn't dig deep enough. So that's the general advice I could give you on that. So let's move on to some beverage for a minute. So this is a shoot for Balvenie. And we had a couple of considerations in the brief that the client wanted addressed. First of all, to make it look really beautiful. Second, they didn't really know for sure all the backgrounds that this would be used on. Which sometimes when you hear that as a retoucher, that can be pretty scary. Especially when there's so much transparency. A lot of people run into this, and a lot of people ask me this question. They're like, how do I get this glass to go on multiple different colored backgrounds, light backgrounds, dark backgrounds, and a whole rainbow of colors? They're like, if I set it up on a blend mode, not the right parts become transparent. And there is a way to manage that. And so when you're looking at this glass, and this is where you start to change your perspective as a retoucher, where the thing is not a thing, it's a collection of pixels. And this collection of pixels has three main different qualities. What are the colors of that pixel? What are the lightness and darkness of the pixels? And what's the saturation, to be really general. Now, this isn't perfect, but it's pretty good. What you need to do when you're trying to create transparency is think about what are the things that need to be opaque and what are the things that need to be transparent. So for me, with this glass, the things that need to be opaque are the bright reflections and where the light is caught in the base, and also the dark reflections need to be opaque, because those are the only visual elements that make up the whole glass. And this is part of breaking up retouching problems into their component parts. So logos separate, that's pretty easy to do. There's a little bit of coaster reflection in there. I'm gonna put this back on white. Well, it's kind of like a quarter gray. And so I'll open up the transparency here. So let's check out the highlights. So just like you saw in that other file, I was like, okay, first thing I need to do is isolate these highlight reflections because they need to sit up on top. So that's what I did. That's a mask that I pulled from a channel. So I'm going to turn that mask off and see if I can show you the glass itself. So that's what the glass looks like. Now I desaturated the whole thing because I just wanted it to be white. And I applied that mask and set it to screen. Made a few slight curves adjustments, but those are the highlights. And now below it, the shadows. So there's your glass with a couple little additional elements that I put in here. This glass is basically just the dark reflections and the bright reflections. Shadows are set to multiply, highlights set to screen, and then I filled that base with some white. And that perplexes so many people. And once you see it happen, it just seems pretty basic, at least to me anyway. Are there any comments about that? Is that clear? Because I can.
Steph, I think that so we're getting the same question on Facebook as we do on Zoom, which is about 8-bit. We have a couple of people saying, why exactly would you work in 8-bit? And then somebody else asks, do you ever work in 16-bit?
That's a good question, and I get it a ton. I do not work in 16-bit 99% of the time. Now, why is that? Because you'll find yourself on Facebook groups for like 16-bit all the way, only way to go. I'm like, most of these files that I'm showing you right here are like 5 or 6 gigs working files. if I was working in 16, I'd be dead in the water. So most of the work that me and all my colleagues do is in 8-bit. Now, what does that mean? That means that there's less information in the actual file. There's smaller range of grays. There's smaller amount of color values. And so we've had to develop a couple workflows around that, which in particular, that one about gradients and banding. A lot of people mistakenly think that, oh, bands can't be controlled in 8-bit. You have to go into 16. That's not true. All banding can be controlled in 8-bit. You just have to know how to do it. 16-bit is great because you can, like I showed you earlier with the gradient I painted for that background, you can paint all you want with all these different colors and you just never see bands. And then if you convert it back into 8-bit, it's magically band free too. So that's due to a couple of things. First of all, you're working in 16, which great. There are all these, you know, the distance between a value of like this gray or dark red value to this light red or light gray value, there's all these different shades within that. So when you paint, you don't see any bands because Photoshop is able to use all these colors in between. When you come down to 8, the number of colors between those two colors you're painting with is much fewer. So that's why you see bands. So in 8-bit, you still have that lower number of gradations. But the thing that eliminates the bands when going from 16 to 8 is that Photoshop's rendering engine does this really beautiful dithering between band edges. So they're still there, you just don't see them. That's sort of a really bird's eye view of banding between 8 and 16-bit. Visually, I don't really care about quality differences between 8 and 16. I'll be honest. In the future, as Photoshop and computer power gets better, I probably would opt to move into 16, but right now I'm still in the 8-bit camp. So it looks like you guys got a poll up. What do you use? What Wacom products do you use?
Well, Seth, that's for our audience, and we're getting a lot of people who are using the Intuos Pro, certainly
Cool.
some people using the displays. Ricardo Garcia would like to know which shortcuts you manage in the pen and tablet. So on your Wacom devices, which shortcuts do you have going?
Well, so that is, yeah, it's like I go back and forth. I go through phases where I will use tablet buttons. Right now I have pretty limited space on my desk, so I actually switched back to the Intuos Bluetooth, the little one that I just showed you, which it does have buttons on it, and occasionally I'll use that when I'm clipping, but I don't use a whole lot of shortcuts on those, to be honest. I think the reason I go back and forth is because I love the simplicity of some of these products that are just like, they're just tablets. A simple form factor is sometimes a really, really nice thing. Got a lot of Intuos Pro users. That's awesome. Cool. So I'll just show you how I broke up this file in the layers. I have this group, once again, everything can turn on and off, move, that's what I want to see in my work file. I usually have a color correction group over the top that I usually call CCOA. Even within this group, so you can kind of see what the bottle looked like before. I do like a good before and after. So that's where I went. So take a look at the decisions made here. This is tough, and trying to figure out how to make decisions about like, well, what do I remove in the bottle and what do I keep can sometimes be like mysterious. So I'm going to open up this bottle layer. There's an overall hue saturation. So notice I got the label here. I want that up on top because I don't want to be messing with the label while I'm messing with the bottle itself. The cap did a bunch of work too. I think I replaced that with a different cap. And I stripped in this bottle because I just want this area to be really nice and smooth. And this bottom area too. I'm going to zoom in way into here so you can see kind of what the standards are. I tried to keep a lot of the natural qualities in the bottom there, but these two lines, these two strips, you know, they look like manufacturing defaults. So that's how those decisions get made. Those get eliminated. And so a lot of color correction overall. And so eliminated a bunch of the reflections from the plexi here because they wanted this to just sit on an opaque surface. And this is part of, actually, this is kind of important to talk about too. If you're coming into a retouching job and you see reflections on a surface like this, a lot of people don't address that up front, but think about doing a retouching job that has reflections like this. Maybe there's even more that you can see. If you don't address that up front with your client, and you need to keep those reflections in there, and you bid the job to do the retouching on the glass, the bottle, and the box, think about how you're going to address those reflections, because that's almost like doing the retouching twice if you also have to retouch the reflections, because it's very rare that you can actually flip those down there and make them look like reflections. It's just something I've run into a bunch and it's easily overlooked. So box, glass. Now these shadows, this is something I learned years ago when I was first getting into product retouching. And let me see if I can just show you my layers real quick. Shadows, there we go. So shadows really consist of what I think of as kind of three components in product stuff. So I'll do a really loose, big, loose, low opacity layer for the base shadow. And then I start to build it up in this way, adjusting opacity and smoothness. And these are just painting, literally painting on pixel layer with a brush and creating these lines. So now we have these like more like touching shadows where the product is going to touch the surface. And so there's usually three components, like a big loose one that kind of gives the whole thing a presence on the surface. The second one is a little bit tighter, which will extend a little bit out from the product. Let me turn it back on. And then the final one is going to be a really fine touch point shadow. So you see that. Just if you're ever asked to you know, paint in shadows, it's not that hard. You just have to think of it in those three components. And a lot of people look at this layer on top. This is going to be hard to see on this file, but I use Adobe Camera Raw for grain because, and I've got an action I can get to you guys to make this layer. It's really useful because, once again, this is a smart object. You can apply Camera Raw as a smart filter, and it's super powerful. You apply it to a 50% gray layer that's set to overlay in this way. You can just apply Camera Raw's grain, and the only thing you'll see is the grain because it's set to a soft light in this case, blend mode. I'll set it really strong to see if I can crank it up. Yeah, you can see maybe that grain. You know, and grain is one of those things that like usually sits at the top of a file and it just like ties the room together.
So Seth, we're at 1 o'clock.
Cool.
And we have some questions. Do you want to keep going and show this Rip City shirt, or do you want to answer some questions?
Yeah, let's answer some questions because this next file is kind of something, it's much more production oriented and it's going to be interesting not only for retouchers, but also graphic designers.
Okay. So one question that Nick asks is, what was it in the Wacom One that made it so much better?
Well, price for one thing. You know, and this is something I talked about a few days ago at the B&H conference, is why I like that, you know, Wacom keeps making really high quality products in more accessible versions for people. And the one is just incredible that you can get it for that price and it's as good as it is. It's also super light. I thought the 16 that I have was going to be, you know, like my travel display tablet, but I've got it mounted to an arm, so it's tough for me to take off. So when I got the one, I was like, okay, this is sweet. This can sit right on my desk, and I can just unplug it and go. I have it connected to an HDMI extension that plugs into my machine, and then it's just the power cord. So I can grab that in 2 minutes, and it's super slim. I mean, it looks cool too, but it's got the right amount of weight to it that it feels like a substantial, like a tough tablet, and light enough that it can go into my bag with my laptop. Yeah, and if you weren't here in the beginning, I was kind of waxing on the Wacom One. It really is incredible for my whole clipping game, my whole vector path clipping game. I can drag my image over onto the screen and I can just draw all my vector lines right on the actual photo, and it just improves my clipping time by like 2 or 3 times.
Well, do you want to show us this last one? Yeah. Okay.
Totally. So this is a really cool production trick that my buddy Earth showed me. Let me go full screen. So we had this project with all of these different team jerseys. This is a Nike deal. And so we had to do a bunch of retouching on all the jerseys. There was like 40 or something like that. And so in each folder, we've got just this linked smart object. And so we were like, man, this is not only going to be a ton of retouching, but it's going to be a ton of stuff to output because they all have to be on background colors that are different. So you can see all these background colors, and they have shadows and a couple of variations of the shadows. I don't know about you, but that would take like a day of just going through and switching on and off layers and hitting, merge flat and to send out the files themselves. So what we came up with was this way of using layer comps, which is very, very cool. So it did take the time of front loading all of this stuff into layer comps. So, retouchers working with graphic designers, this is where we overlap because they can actually use these master files like graphic designers, if you set them up right, to change stuff in their InDesign document. So if I change this jersey, what it does is you'll see it changed the this layer group for the team. I'll click back to Portland. See that visibility? Because what I did was I set the visibility for this team, and it also changed. I'm going to take this off so we can keep it up. It also changed the background color. So we paired these layer comp states with the different team. And there's also away and home, and the different background color that changes with each team. So when you do that, you can do file, is it an export? Sorry if I'm not remembering this right. Yeah, layer comps to files. So that is a beautiful little production workflow. You can output with this module all of these layer comps automatically to save out to files with the names that you've created in the layer comp. So not a production retouching job. I mean, not a creative retouching job, a production retouching job. So you see the different considerations that come into play once you have something that is based on lots and lots of versions, lots and lots of files, lots and lots of products, as opposed to a creative retouching file. Another really cool, the last cool thing in this demo is these are linked smart objects. I think I can open this. Now it's looking for the file. You can change the state of layer comps within a linked smart object. And it may be tricky to show this, but say Miami. So I can turn the shadow on and off using the properties panel dropdown, where it applies a layer comp that is kept inside that jersey's linked smart object. But I moved the file, so I can't show you how that happens. Keep it in mind, there are these solutions that Adobe is really improving on. They're a little bit esoteric, but when you're faced with jobs like this, and especially where you need to work with a graphic designer, if you start really getting good at layer comps, graphic designers are actually able to control layer comps in their InDesign documents in ways like this. So rather than having to ask, a retoucher, oh, can you output this different file for me? They can be totally working on, on the individual retouching files in there, and graphic designers within their InDesign doc can be changing layer comp properties within the Photoshop file that they're linked to. Now, are there any questions on that point? It was a little vague.
We have do you find the need to keep track of your revisions? Do you use layer comps or other notations to keep track of revision rounds?
Yeah, totally. So I don't use layer comps to keep track of revisions. But what I do is at the top of every work file, I just have like an assets folder. And when I get either a markup back from a client where they've actually marked up the file, but usually these days it's just like notes in an email, or maybe they use Dropbox paper and they're using notes to point to certain areas of the image. I'll basically screen grab all of that and just paste it into the top of my Photoshop file in that assets folder. That way I always have a record of each revision round. I try to get away from having multiple versions of my work file in order to preserve like rounds. It just gets a little clunky. There are some times when you like, okay, the client might be asking me something right now that they might step back on, so I'm going to save out a backup file, but I always keep a record.
Okay, so last question, and just for everybody who's watching, we will send out an email after this is over, which will have a link to the file, to the video on YouTube. It will also have links to Steph's social media channels and where you can find him teaching more. But it looked like, based on the questions, there were a lot of people who were interested in kind of breaking into commercial retouching. And so we had a couple of questions from people who wanted to know, how do you start to learn how to use your Wacom product with photo retouching?
Yeah, I would say just always have it have it there in front of you. There are times that a mouse is important to use, so they're good to have around. But you can use one of the Intuos tablets as your interface for your entire computer, and that's what I've done for years. I'm mostly using my pen to navigate around my computer, not just in Photoshop, but into all sorts of different programs. So it works basically the same way a mouse does. I can lots of times just have the mouse sitting over on the side of my desk for, a week or so until I need it. And yeah, practicing things like the basics of retouching, if you're trying to go for that more commercial style. I teach how to do it in my tutorials online, and I always recommend that people get really good at doing the basics of retouching. Learning how to clip stuff out, isolate stuff, using the pen tool. Learn how to create those paths, your library of paths that are later going to be used for masks. Learn how to make those paths into masks. Learn how to do some basic cleanup using the clone stamp tool, healing brush tool. Right there, stay in that zone and get really good at that stuff, because when you're trying to break into the industry or get an entry-level position, people aren't going to be paying you to come in and be super creative, and somebody else is going to be doing that job. To get your foot in the door, they're going to want somebody who's solid to sit down and start doing prep for them. There are all sorts of photo studios that, depending on the time of the year and how much product they're shooting, they just need people in those seats doing tons and tons of technical prep work. And that's the way to break in, because if you can get in someplace just doing that stuff, you'll be around senior or higher level retouchers who you're going to learn from, because in those situations, mentorship is gold. That's where you want to get when you're first starting out. Don't think you're going to go out there online and just watch tutorial after tutorial and just get really, really good and become a senior, like in the privacy of your home. You'll never do that, because the only way you learn to a high level is to be on the job, on real jobs, under deadline, and within budgets.
All right, Seth. Well, that was really great. Do you want to plug your website? We have it in the chat, but do you want to plug your website?
Cool. Yeah. So I have a lot of different stuff online, but the most recent, so I have tutorials, many full-length tutorials that are like the real techniques in commercial retouching that I use at proedu.com. And starting with my commercial workflow tutorial, that starts right at the basics and takes you through all of the steps that I just described, and then more from beginning to end onto as close to reality retouching jobs as we could show you, including client interactions and feedback. My recent site that I just put up is frequencyseparation.com, and there you can go and get a free download of my actions to do frequency separation. And I'm going to be putting new tools up there all the time that are going to be free to download, stuff that I use in my workflow. So for instance, this job I did, sorry, I just zoomed right into his mouth. When I first got my big break into commercial retouching, this was the first big challenging job that ever dropped in my lap. And this guy had a bunch of patches all over, and they were like, Seth, we need you to remove those patches. And I did not know how to do that. I knew how to clone stuff. I knew how to healing brush stuff, but to remove all of these patches, I just about walked out because I just felt like I was going to fail. There's just not enough area to clone from in this. So I banged my head against the wall like for half a day on this. And then I went and asked one of the seniors, and he was like, well, just zoom in there. This isn't anything but like just blue and red and some grain. So start thinking about it like that and see if you can figure it out. So really badly, I figured it out. And this is like my real work. There's some bad stuff in here, but this is how I figured it out. And I basically just started painting with red, and then I slapped grain on it and baked it in. Pretty bad workflow, but I got the job done. So when we're talking about frequency separation, this is basically me figuring it out for myself the first time, where I was just thinking about, this is just red, and then there's some texture on top, which is grain. So if you can start thinking about your images and the problems you have to solve in that way, that's going to help you achieve things that you couldn't before. And you can go to frequency separation, download my actions for free, and start using them today and start experimenting with this way of looking at your imagery. Did I just not show that whole image because I was on a different screen?
No, we saw it.
Oh, you did? Oh, because
Yeah.
I'm still sharing. Okay, cool.
Yeah. Let me double check our questions and make sure we have most of them covered. Oh, this is nice. Alan said, just wanted to say thank you for this. I'm a semi-retired architect and photographer, and this was very interesting and amazing to see.
Cool.
You inspired him to delve more into Photoshop, Seth.
That's great. Awesome.
Well, we are at the end, and so all of the participants, we will show a code so that people can purchase either a new Intuos Pro Medium and get $100 off for Adobe Creative Cloud photo plan, or save $50 on the Wacom One at B&H. Both of those are at B&H here in the US. And then in Canada, you can purchase the Wacom One and get a free version of Corel Painter 2020 for a $500 value. Well, thank you, Seth. As
Yeah.
always, we love hearing from you, and we really appreciate your time today.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I hope I helped give at least one different sort of workflow people could start to think about in their own work. So this is the first time I've showed these files. So let me know and connect with me online too on Facebook. I'm out there answering questions, and I'm totally down to help you guys more if you're trying to figure something out.
Okay. Thank you. And thank you, everybody watching this webinar. We have another one coming up on Tuesday with Colin Smith.
Bye, guys. Thanks.
Thank you.